Hello there and welcome to our third video in this series for Kingdom Plantae. So this video is going to be focusing on group Pteridophytes, which are most iconically represented by ferns. And before I go on with the actual lesson, I would just like to remind you that there is a worksheet for this subtopic. And in the previous video, we went through the unique characteristics for Kingdom Plantae and also the unique characteristics that is specific for group Bryophyte. I also asked you to draw or print out pictures for Polytrichum species, Marchantia species, and Anthoceros species. I also mentioned in the previous video that you should write down the terrestrial adaptations for bryophytes somewhere in this worksheet. I'm sorry I forgot to put that in when I was making the worksheet. For today's video, we are going to be focusing on the next page, which is group Pteridophytes. So make sure you take note of the unique characteristics of Pteridophytes and put them in here. Okay, we'll also have a section that will explain a bit more about spores. And last but not least, you should be able to fill in information to compare between phylum Lycophyta and phylum Pteridophyta. Alright, if you're ready, let's get into this video. Start. So, group Pteridophytes. The objectives for this part of the chapter is that you should be able to describe the unique characteristics of Pteridophytes, and you should also be able to state the classification of Pteridophytes into two phyla, which is phylum Lycophyta and phylum Pterophyta. So, what are the unique characteristics of Pteridophytes? First of all, you should know that their habitat is most common in damp or moist places. So, tempat yang basa-basa, sikit, not very hot. That's where you will find Pteridophytes. They would have flagellated sperm cells, which must swim through a film of water to reach the egg cell. So, they're quite in this aspect, in the aspect of like how their sperm is structured, their sperm also have flagella. Their sperm need water to swim from the male part to the female part. And they are seedless plants. They do not produce seeds. They have simple lignified vascular tissues to transport water and nutrients and minerals, and also to provide mechanical support. So remember, Pteridophytes have simple, lignified vascular tissues. This means their phloem and xylem have lignin in the cell walls. But their vascular tissues are not well developed, so it's not a complex vascular system. It's quite simple compared to those of gymnosperms and angiosperms. Their dominant generation is sporophyte. That means the sporophyte generation is large in size and long-lived. The gametophyte is small in size and free-living. It will not be attached to the sporophyte. The young sporophyte, after it is fertilized, when it is just starting to grow, will be dependent on gametophyte for nutrition. Whereas matured sporophyte is not dependent on gametophyte for nutrition because it can carry out photosynthesis. In other words, it starts with small gametophyte, small and free-living gametophyte. Once the female gamete is fertilized by the male gamete, it is a zygote. And as that zygote is growing as an embryo and as a young sporophyte, it cannot produce its own food yet. Okay? So, masa dia masih kecil itu, dia belum lagi boleh buat makanan sendiri, dia belum cukup fotosintesis, dia akan bergantung kepada gametophyte. Tapi bila gametophyte itu cukup matang, cukup besar, dia boleh buat fotosintesis sendiri, then it will no longer be dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. And eventually the gametophyte part will die, and the sporophyte will keep growing and growing and growing. Most pteridophytes are heterosporous, some are homosporous. So what is this about homosporous or heterosporous? So there's two types of pteridophytes that we can separate based on production of spores. If it is homosporous, it has only one type of sporangium that will produce one type of spore. Examples of this are Lycopodium species and Dryopteris species. The second type of spore is heterosporous. Plants that are heterosporous will have two types of sporangia that will produce two types of spores. So it has sporangia that can produce microspore and sporangia that can produce megaspore. An example for this is Selaginella species. So let's look closer at what is homosporous and what is heterosporous. If it is homosporous, it will have a diploid sporangium. Okay, the sporophyte will have sporangium. The cells in the sporangium will divide by meiosis to produce haploid spore. And that haploid spore, once it is released, it will develop into bisexual gametophyte. Maksudnya, satu jenis gametophyte itu dia boleh menghasilkan archegonia and antheridia. That bisexual gametophyte from a homosporous pteridophyte will consist of archegonia and antheridia. It has both sexes. The archegonia will produce egg cell. The antheridia will produce sperm cell. How about in a heterosporous pteridophyte? A heterosporous pteridophyte will have two types of sporangium, so that one sporophyte can have megasporangium. If that sporophyte has megasporangium, cells in the megasporangium will divide by meiosis to produce megaspore. That megaspore, once it is released, will develop into unisexual female gametophyte. That means ya satu sex sahaja, and that sex is female. That unisexual female gametophyte will produce an archegonia. In the archegonia, it will produce egg cell. Whereas, if that heterosporous pteridophyte has microsporangium, okay, it is a sporophyte with microsporangium, it will produce microspores. Those microspores, when released into the environment, will develop into unisexual male gametophyte. Gametophyte dia satu seks sahaja, yaitu jantan. That unisexual male gametophyte will consist of antheridia. That antheridia, cells in the antheridia will produce sperm cell. So essentially what it is saying is, if it's homosporous, same plant, egg cell, sperm cell. Heterosporous, different plant, either egg cell or sperm cell, satu saja. So this is an example of gametophytes. Okay, so this is in Dryopteris species, a type of fern. Fern gametophytes will produce prothallus that are teeny tiny structures that often grow on or just below the cell surface. Ini yang betul-betul zoom ni baru nampak. Okay, so these are very tiny. They form a prothallus, which is almost a thallus shape, but not really. So it's kind of like a love. Okay, so this is on the Dryopteris species. The gametophyte is here. Okay, and from the gametophyte, dekat dia punya archegonium. Alright, over here, not archegonium, dia punya dari archegonium. From its archegonium, after the egg is fertilized, the sporophyte will start growing from here. This is the developing sporophyte. So when it is this small and when it is this young, it will depend on the gametophyte for nutrition. Tengok ni, dia belum ada akar sendiri, belum cukup dia punya photosynthesis. Ini adalah dia punya sporophyte. Ini dia punya gametophyte. Its reproduction requires a watery medium. So as you see here, this is the archegonium, the female reproductive organ, and over here is the male part, the antheridium. Okay, the antheridium will release the flagellated sperm or sperm with flagella that will swim around in the water until it finds archegonium and then fertilizes the egg cell. When it's grown, in its sporophyte stage, it will have true roots, stems, and leaves. So these are the true roots, true stem, and true leaves. So this is Selaginella species. It's a very beautiful plant. This is its sporophyte generation, the dominant sporophyte generation. Okay, that's the stem part. Those are the leafy leaves. A very, very beautiful plant, Selaginella species. This is a Lycopodium species. This is its dominant sporophyte generation, which is the part you can see very, very clearly with your naked eyes. This is Dryopteris species, the most common looking thing I'm sure you can identify fern very easily if you look at it in the wild. Okay, so this is the dominant sporophyte generation of Dryopteris species. So when we classify pteridophytes, we can classify it into two phylum, which is phylum Lycophyta or Lycopodiophyta, which is club moss. And the examples of species for these are Lycopodium species and Selaginella species. Another example, another phylum is phylum Pterophyta or phylum Pteridophyta, and these are ferns. Example of Pterophyta is Dryopteris species. What are other unique characteristics of pteridophytes is that pteridophytes has true roots, stems, and leaves due to the presence of vascular tissues. It has stomata that will allow gaseous exchange and transpiration. Sporophytes have adventitious roots, and it has waterproof cuticle. Regarding adventitious roots, you can Google this if you don't quite understand what the way I explain it. But basically, adventitious roots is there are some parts of the plant that are still meristematic. So macam contoh dia terpotong, dia pergi tempat lain, and it wants to grow new roots. It can grow that from some parts of the plants. Okay, adventitious roots, and waterproof cuticle to prevent water loss. In regards to fertilization, fertilization of pteridophytes is fully dependent on water medium. So it has flagellated sperm cells that must swim through a film of water to reach the egg cell, and therefore it really needs water to reproduce. Pteridophytes can reproduce sexually by producing spores or dispersion. Spores will produce gametophytes. Gametophytes produces female or male gametes. So this is example of what the sporangium looks like. Okay, so these are sporangium under pteridophytes. Okay, these are multicellular organs that will produce spores. Dia nampak berbiji-biji macam ni di bawah daun, bahagian bawah daun. So these are the sporangia. Singular sporangium, plural sporangia. Okay. So you may see in your notes there's some parts that mention microphylls, sporophylls, and strobilus. What are those? So let's look at this example of Lycopodium species. Microphylls are small, spine-shaped leaves. So dia daun yang kecil dan macam tajam-tajam sikit nampak bentuk dia. Sporophylls are modified leaves that bear sporangia. Okay? Sporophylls are modified microphylls that have sporangia. Sporangia, the part that will produce spores. And strobilus is when you arrange a group of sporophylls. Strobilus will form a cone-like structure like this. So in this diagram here, these are the microphylls. These are microphylls, P-H-Y-L-L-S, microphylls. Sporophyll, ini adalah sporophyll, daun yang modify untuk melindungi sporangium. Okay, dalam dia sporangium, 1 sporangium, 2 sporangium, 3 sporangium, 4 sporangium. Dalam setiap sporangium ada spores. Okay, within each sporangium, you will have lots and lots and lots of spores. And then when you arrange those sporophylls like this, okay, it will form a cone-like structure, and that cone-like structure is called a strobilus. Strobilus. So this is the example on Selaginella species. So you can see the strobilus on the Selaginella species is like this, a little bit different from how the microphylls look. Tu microphyll dia macam terbuka lagi kan? Strobilus dia macam kecil sebab dia melindungi sporangium di dalam. Okay. Selaginella is an example of plant that is heterosporous. Yeah, it's heterosporous. So it will produce 2 types of spores. It has 2 types of sporangium. So dia ada yang betina dan yang jantan. Yang betina, the female one, is the megasporangium on the left. Sporangium will contain a megaspore. You can even call the sporophyll that is protecting the megasporangium as megasporophyll. On the right side is the male part, which contains the microsporangium. In the microsporangium, there are microspores, and the microspores protected by the microsporangium protected by microsporophyll. So Selaginella species is one of those heterosporous plants that can contain the male and female on the same plant, and this is on the left and right side of the same strobilus. But it is quite small. The diagram on the right is obtained by observing it through a microscope. So kalau kita tengok secara mata kasar memang susah sikit mau tengok. Tapi kita tengok di bawah microscope boleh nampak dengan jelas mana yang jantan, mana yang betina. Okay, so that is example of the spores on Selaginella species. This is an example of the Dryopteris species. You've seen this diagram a few times already, but this diagram is kind of tell you the structure of the Dryopteris species. So just now we talked about microphylls, which are like needle-shaped leaves. Now we're looking at more leafy leaves. So the Dryopteris has roots, these rachis, which is kind of like, or rachi, I'm not sure the proper way to pronounce this, which is kind of like the stem-ish part, okay? This is stem, this is kind of branch, rachis, branch. And this leafy part is called the frond. Okay, Dryopteris and other ferns, we don't really call it leaf. Kalau satu structure besar macam ni, macam ada banyak kecil-kecil macam ni, kita panggil dia frond. On one frond, this segment is called a pinna. The even smaller segments on the pinna is called the pinnule. Okay, so the daripada rachis will have frond, in the frond you'll have pinna, in the pinna you'll have pinnule. For ferns, it has sorus located on the underside of its sporophylls, Dryopteris species. Okay, so these sorus are clusters of sporangia. Dia banyak sporangia, dia kumpul-kumpul macam ni dalam structure macam ni. Satu structure macam ini dia dipanggil sebagai sorus. So this is example of sorus. On the right is also example of sorus, but these are more mature spores, so you can already see it's very dark and brown. Okay, if you've ever seen ferns in the wild, you can look on the underside of the leaves, di bagian bawah daun there, you will see the spores in clusters like this. Each sorus, satu biji-biji. Okay, when we're talking about ferns and Pteridophyta, okay, just very common example of Dryopteris, you would have these younger fronds called fiddleheads. Bila dia masih muda, dia belum macam terbuka sepenuhnya, dia berbentuk macam ni, kita panggil dia fiddlehead. How that word came to be is this is a fiddle, it's not a violin, it's a musical instrument called a fiddle. And if you look at the head, that looks very similar to the ferns, don't it? Yeah. So the unfurled fronds is also called a fiddlehead because it looks like the head of a fiddle. Yeah. So these are examples of more fiddleheads of Dryopteris species. They can be many colors and they look fuzzy. Okay, so we can compare between these two phylum in Pteridophytes. In Lycophyta and in Pterophyta, we can give examples of species for each phylum. In phylum Lycophyta, we can have Lycopodium species, Selaginella species. In phylum Pterophyta, we can have Dryopteris species as our most common example. In Lycophyta, they have small scaly leaves called sporophylls, whereas in phylum Pterophyta, they have fronds or pinna divided into leaflets or pinnules. In phylum Lycophyta, sporangia on sporophyll are grouped together, forming strobilus. Whereas in phylum Pterophyta, the cluster of sporangia or sori are on the back of sporophylls. In phylum Lycophyta, the gametophyte body lacks chlorophyll, whereas in phylum Pterophyta, the gametophyte body or the prothallus has chlorophyll for photosynthesis. But both still have dominant generation of sporophyte. What is the similarity between phylum Lycophyta and phylum Pterophyta is that both of them have antheridia and archegonia, which grow on the same gametophyte. And for both phylum, water is essential for fertilization. I may or may not have mentioned this in your class before, but the comparison between Lycophyta and Pterophyta led some scientists to believe that these two, although they are in group Pteridophytes, they're actually kind of different from each other. And some people have called Lycophyta as moss-like and phylum Pterophyta as fern-like. And some scientists have even started to ignore group Pteridophytes and just study these two phylum differently. But for your syllabus, we are studying them together because we are basing it on morphology. Okay, so that is pretty much it for this part of the chapter. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. I hope that you'll continue to fill in the worksheet as we go on, and I hope the explanations are clear enough. If it's not clear enough or your curiosity is not satisfied, do feel free to read more notes, more books, or look up more videos on the topic of pteridophytes if that piques your interest. That is all from me for this time. Thank you very much, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye!